Good evening and shalom and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Welcome to Un-Apologetics, where we are unapologetic about our apologetics. And I am your host, C.J. Cox. And before we get started, I just want to say a very brief prayer. So if you would like to join me, I'd certainly encourage you to do so. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for everything that you've blessed us with, Lord, that you continue to bless us with, Lord. I pray that you just use this video, Lord, as nothing more than glorification of your word and glorification of your holy name, Lord, and that through this video, people might see the truth of your word, Lord, and be closer to you as a result of it, Lord, if it be your will. In Jesus Christ's name I pray. Amen. All right. Real quickly, just want to say briefly, general announcements. If you want to check out any of our videos we've done recently on Black Hebrew Israelism or our interview with Kent Hovind, you can certainly do so. You can find two videos that are actually going to be on the topic we're talking about today that I've already done before, and I will reference those at the end of this. And of course, if you're interested in any good church services, I would definitely recommend going to gracenapa.org to listen to some phenomenal church services there. At any rate, though, I do kind of want to just move on to the topic at hand here, because those of you who have watched these videos may recall that I called out a rabbi by the name of Pelah ben Avraham of a YouTube channel that is now known as Karaite Jews Judaism USA, right? Called him out on some of his just absolutely laughable historical garbage that he was propagating as truth and backed up by historical evidence on his YouTube channel in regards to the origins of the Christian faith. I split these into two different videos, one talking about translation and comparison of the Tanakh to the Old Testament, and one that was actually talking about this topic, right? The topic we are currently addressing, which is the Ebionites and the origin of Christianity, right? Whether or not James and Paul had a massive schism and all that kind of stuff. And so we addressed it, and Rabbi Ben Avraham actually said that he was going to address my claims in a video, that he was going to respond to the video, and then I gave him the opportunity to debate me on the topics, and he said that he would love to, right? So I gave him my email and was never emailed. This video that I was promised never came, right? This video refuting what I had said in my video never came. This debate never came, right? So I email him, never emails me back. Then actually deletes his comments on my video, which was a very cowardly and deceitful thing to do. I would just like to point out. I don't mean to be rude, but that's just. I mean, I don't even understand how you can take yourself seriously when you pull stuff like that. But at any rate, now I see here in my feed, right, a video, like 20-ish minute video, coming out from him, and it's more of the same garbage, same nonsense, right? Same huge feud between Paul and the quote original followers of Yeshua, and massive split that ends in the Ebionites versus the Roman Catholic Church, essentially. And we're going to go into further detail on that, but I couldn't believe myself that this guy was still actually going around propagating this nonsense. I mean, to a certain extent, I'm really not too surprised, because I see a lot of people do this, right? This is the same thing that we had Rod Bergen do, right? They go out of their way to say, oh, these are the undisputed facts, and then when they are shown to be very clearly wrong, they just completely disregard what it is that's been said, which is kind of hilarious. But at any rate, I commented on the video, right? Because I watched the video, and so I commented on it. It's just like, this is nonsense. The things that you're saying here are historical garbage. You're clearly not a scholar of any caliber. And quite frankly, you are a deceitful person. Rabbi Ben Avraham, if you are watching this, you are a deceitful person, because either A, you have actually read what the historical record says and are lying about it, or B, you are lying about having read what the historical record says. And I think we're going to prove that pretty definitively here in this video. So, and we're not going to delve into this topic too long, right? It'll only be about an hour video. We only really do the 2 hours on Sunday anyways. But nonetheless, I think that this is just a topic that is very, very, very important to address for a few reasons. The main, most important reason actually being that this man has over 10,000 subscribers who are going to be listening to the things that he says. We're going to be missing out on their Messiah because of false, misleading, patently untrue, and absurd arguments. Things that don't make any sense in light of the historical record, things that don't make any sense in light of church history or in light of even the history of Judaism, right? Things that are blatantly false, and known to be false, and have been something that have, like, the things that we have known to be false for hundreds of years at this point, right? Um, and these people, these 10,000 some odd people, right, are missing out on their Messiah, deceived because of a man who clearly has no idea what he's talking about and is too much of a coward to actually back up his own words in saying that he will defend this ridiculous doctrine that he is talking about. So what is it? What is it that he's saying, right? Well, essentially, it boils down to, and we're going to refute these points here, and then we're also going to go through the comments that the comment war I actually had with him on his video. I'll just read them to you. Nonetheless, though, the basics of his points, there's about 5 or 6 of them. Point number 1 is that Jesus originally was preaching a gospel that had him as only a man, only a prophet, not divine, not the Son of God, not even the Messiah, allegedly, according to what Rabbi Ben Avraham says in this video. And you can watch the video for yourself if you don't believe me. Okay? He says that Jesus was not preaching that he was the Messiah. Point number 2, he has that there was a major schism, massive schism, in the very early 1st century AD, right about maybe 2 to 3 decades after the crucifixion of Christ in 33 AD. He says there was a massive schism between what he terms, quote, the true followers of Jesus, which would be the 12 disciples like John, Peter, and apparently they were under the leadership, according to Rabbi Ben Avraham, of James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul. James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul have a massive schism. Point number 3 that he has is basically that James's group turns into the Ebionites, and that as a result, the Ebionites back up all of the different claims he is making about what they originally believed, right? That Jesus was just a man, not the Messiah, all that other kind of, not the basics of anybody who wants to say Jesus was a good guy but wasn't actually the Messiah, right? Which is essentially what he's claiming at this point. It's kind of a rehashed Muslim argument. It's really interesting, but nonetheless, I digress. Point number 4, that the Roman Catholic Church is what became of Paul's group, that Paul actually founded this Roman Catholic organization. And point number 5, that everything Jewish was stamped out and the Old New Testament fabricated to cover it up. Okay, these are the 5 basic points that he makes here. And the thing is that is while it's put together in a coherent manner, right? If there were the right pieces in play, it would actually be something that's logical. I'm sure religions have actually started like that. The problem is there is absolutely no historical documentation of this whatsoever. And I mean, like, this is one of the most fringe and ridiculous ahistorical anachronistic scholarly works, theories, if you want to actually term them that, that I have found in a very long time. Let's just start with that point number 1, the claim that Jesus didn't say, Jesus was originally claiming that he was not the Son of God, right? That he was not the Messiah, that he was just a prophet, that he was not divine, just a regular man, Torah observant, all that kind of stuff. Now, the first thing I want to actually point out, too, that's something that actually really irritates me about people who argue this, is it's not like the early Christians and Jesus and Paul the Apostle were not Torah observant, okay? They were not Torah-centric. That is a very, very big distinction. They were Jesus-centric, right? This is the whole point of actually numerous instances of Scripture. You have James talk about faith without works is dead, right? You have Paul giving different legalistic recommendations. For example, 1 Corinthians 7:36 to marry a woman only after the flowering of her age, right? And numerous other instances like that. So it's not, and you have references all the time of them following the Sabbath in Acts, right? I mean, it's patently absurd to say that these people were not Torah observant or that they somehow were preaching against the Torah. That's not at all true. They were not Torah-centric. They were not saying you need to be circumcised in order to be saved. You need to not eat pigs in order to be saved. And they all came to agreement, by the way, in the Council of Jerusalem over most of that stuff, but we'll get to that in a moment. So that's just the first problem. The second problem, there's just no historical documentation whatsoever that Jesus made these claims about himself, right? That he was just a prophet, that he was not divine, at all. There's none, at all, okay? We don't have any of the 12 disciples claiming such. We don't have Jesus himself claiming such. We don't have any direct pupils of the 12 disciples claiming such. We don't have any direct pupils of the direct pupils of the 12 disciples claiming such. We don't have any early cultic leaders claiming such. We have nobody at all claiming these things about Jesus. In fact, the earliest historical documentation you can find that claims Jesus was anything but the Messiah, at the very least, is late, like thousands, right? Who believed in him, of course, because the Jews were always saying that he was not the Messiah, of course, right? Otherwise they wouldn't be Jews. And but as far as people who actually accepted Jesus, right, whether it be the Muslims or the Ebionites or the Nazarenes or the Orthodox Christians or any other splinter group, if the Gnostics, doesn't matter, any of them and all of them were claiming Jesus was the Messiah, because that is one thing that assuredly Jesus claimed about himself. So that claim that Rabbi Ben Avraham made was just patently absurd. So there you have two claims: that he's not Torah observant, that he's preaching against the Torah. Three claims, actually: that he's not Torah observant, that he's preaching against the Torah, and that he didn't claim to be the Messiah, that are just verifiably ridiculous. But even the other things that he's claiming, like, for example, that there were splinter groups that think he was not divine, that is a very, very well documented event. We know that there were splinter groups that thought that he was not divine. We also know when they first appeared, and the Ebionites, the one that he actually names by name, and we're going to get to this further in a little bit, is first named in 189 AD, which is 156 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. And actually, on top of that is about 123 years after Peter, James, Jude, Paul, all of them were 125, 123, around there, right? Were all martyred, right? In fact, it's even about 94 years, no, 89 years. That's even 89 years after the last of the apostles, John, passes away, right? So very, very late in the historical record that these Ebionites are mentioned. But at any rate, I digress. There's just no record of these claims that anybody are making in the historical record at the time. No writings from his disciples, no writings from him, no writings from anybody who surrounded his disciples or his disciples' disciples or anybody like that, right? Who claimed that Jesus was not divine, was not the Son of God, all of that kind of stuff, until much later, until much, much later. In fact, the most, what's the word there that I'm looking for? I guess ancient, if you will. The farthest back, the most historical reference you have to anybody claiming that he was not actually divine is, I believe, you might not be able to quote me on this, but I believe actually Valentinius, sometime around the year 160, 165. But even people like Marcion, you know what I mean, and all those other guys, they definitely thought that he was divine. So the idea that he himself was claiming he wasn't divine, again, it's a theory at best. This is just backed up by absolutely no historical documentation. All of his disciples believed he thought he was divine. All of his disciples believed he thought he was the Messiah. All of his disciples accepted these claims. All of his disciples taught their disciples these claims, and that is the only thing the historical record shows us. And if Rabbi Ben Avraham has any evidence whatsoever to contradict that, I'd love to see it. But he doesn't provide any in his last video that I responded to originally. He doesn't provide any in this video. He doesn't provide any in his dialogue with me, in any of his dialogues with me, right? And the reason is because the evidence doesn't exist. These are not the things Jesus preached. Jesus preached what is taught in the New Testament, and that is why all historical documents outside of the New Testament and all people who were in this line of tradition outside of the New Testament in the first 100, 150, sometimes even as far as 200 years, depending on which part of the world you're in, right, all had these same ideas about Jesus. But nonetheless, I digress. Claim number 2. Big old schism between Paul and James, right? Now, this is just, again, something that the historical record doesn't back up, even in the slightest. There's no reference to this at all. And now here's the thing, too. We actually have a whole ton of evidence to know what it is that these people said. The Christians, here are the Christians, right? Whole bunch of it, whole ton of evidence. We have the New Testament itself, right, which is, and of course, Rabbi Avraham is going to disagree with the dates I give here because he's not a believer, and that's fine. He can come debate me on this if he'd like, and I will thoroughly destroy those arguments because that is an absolutely ridiculous claim that the New Testament was written in these late dates, right? That's just, it's ridiculous. It's nonsensical, not true. But at any rate, we have 8 different authors in the New Testament, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, Peter, Jude, and James. None of them in any of their 27 books mention a feud between James and Paul. A feud as in a massive schism, right? There is, of course, the incident at Antioch that leads to the Council of Jerusalem, right? That definitely does happen, but the only historical records we have, which, again, there's quite a bit of them, all the historical records that we have indicate that there was reconciliation there and that they continued on as the same church. And in fact, the only historical record we have that specifically references that is, of course, Luke's book of Acts, and it definitely affirms that they ended up coming together over that. And even that James himself taught that the Gentiles did not have to observe the entire Torah and that they weren't going to be Torah-centric, but rather Jesus-centric, right? So here we have a historical reference in Acts of this event, right? And we also have a book from James himself, by the way. And we also have a book from Peter that affirms Paul, by the way. And we also have works from Paul that affirm that he ended up being, his position ended up being the prevailing position that was agreed upon by everyone here, which is lines up with what Luke says and lines up with what we have with James, and lines up with what we have in 2 Peter, right? So, in the New Testament, you have very fantastic sources, 8, all before the year 100 AD, and they write 27 different books amongst the 8 of them, all of them having absolutely no reference at all to a schism between James and Paul. But you say, maybe the New Testament can't be trusted, maybe you need to move outside of it. Okay, well, before the year 100, we happen to have 3 different Christian writers, and all 3 of them happen to agree that they don't have, or happen to, well, yeah, I guess it would be agree in the sense, in their lack of description of any feud or schism between James and Paul whatsoever, because none existed, right? And these are Papias, Barnabas, and Clement of Rome. We have their works. They exist right now. You can find them if you want. Absolutely no reference to a feud between James and Paul whatsoever. Between the years 100 and 200, we also have a lot more Christian writers. We have writers that were considered heretical or outside of the faith, like Valentinius and Sibelius and Protaxis and all that. Not commenting or anything on anything that they're talking about. However, it is worthy of note, none of them reference a feud. So these are even the guys outside of the faith. None of them are referencing a feud between James and Paul. Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Ignatius, Polycarp, Tertullian, Origen, Clement of Alexandria. You can continue to go down the line. Ambrose, right, or Jerome, or Eusebius, and none of them, nobody references this feud. The first indication you have of any sort of feud or contradiction between what James taught and what Paul taught, admittedly, is actually a fantastic scholar, but everybody's wrong at some point in their life, right? And in this case, this fantastic scholar was wrong. It was actually Martin Luther. Whenever it was that he was actually developing the Luther Bible. I can't remember when exactly it was, but that was sometime after 1523. He was reading over the book of James, and he thought that the book of James contradicted what was in the works of Paul. So we thought the book of James should actually be left out. Again, I do actually respect Martin Luther as a scholar and a theologian very much. However, he's flat wrong. And we can prove he's flat wrong because there's 1,500 years of history before he brings something up that brings no mention whatsoever to the table of any sort of feud or contradiction between what James taught and what Paul taught, or any sort of schism in the early 1st century in the Christian church. None. Okay? And I'm sorry, but this is something that you would need to have at least one reference for. But there is no references. Not a single one exists. And I challenge Rabbi Ben Avraham again, show me any reference, show me any of the church fathers who claims that there is a schism there between James and Paul. You won't find one. And for the record, that's not even what Martin Luther was claiming. Martin Luther was claiming that James was actually not written by James, which is what I think is a wrong assumption. I think it was written by James and that James does belong in the Bible, right? But that's something we can deal with on another time. The point is, that's not even a reference of a full schism. When you actually have people talking about full-on schisms between Paul and James, that doesn't come until the 19th and 20th centuries, right? People like Raymond Brown and N.T. Wright and other modern scholars who are quote-unquote conservatives, but in reality are just making up ideas that everybody thinks are good ideas because they have books that have sold millions of copies or because they have PhDs or some other nonsense like that, even though there is no historical backing for this whatsoever. And by the way, I know for a fact Rabbi Ben Avraham doesn't have historical backing for this because I pressed him on it. Like I said, we will get to that later. But nonetheless, no reference here at all in the historical record of a feud between Paul and James, even though we have multiple Christian writers and even writers outside of the Bible, by the way. We have the Talmud, right? We have Shepherd of Hermas. We have, what is that called? Antiquities of the Jews, right? And the other works of Josephus Flavius. We have works by Pliny the Elder. We have works by Philo. We have works by Tacitus. There's tons of people out there who are not Christian at all, not associated with Christianity at all, and none of them have any references whatsoever that talk about some sort of a schism between Paul and James. Why does it not exist in the historical record? Well, because it didn't happen, right? That's why it doesn't exist in the historical record. And this next claim, I think, is patently hilarious. It's this idea that James ended up founding the Ebionites, and Rabbi Ben Avraham, as we'll see later on in his comments with me, ended up making an utter fool out of himself on this particular issue. And I'm sorry to put it that way, but that is just the way that it is. So his claim here is, of course, that the Ebionites are the original Christians, that they are the original followers of Jesus, and that James himself was the leader of the Ebionites, the founder of the Ebionites, after there was this big schism that, of course, is not mentioned in any historical records whatsoever. This is just patently absurd. I'm sorry, but it is just patently absurd. First and foremost, like I said, we have tons of writings from Christians. We have the 8 writers of the New Testament. We have Barnabas, Clement of Rome, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, etc. Right? Tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of writers. The first one that mentions the Ebionites, the first, is Irenaeus, 189. Adversus Heresias is the book that he's writing, right, against heresies. He's talking about how heretical the Ebionites were in 189 AD. That is the earliest reference of them in existence, okay? Earliest reference of them in existence. The next reference we have of them is not until the 220s, 230s from Origen, right? So, I mean, that is 40 to 50 years removed from the original reference we have from them. There's, of course, reasons behind this, and we'll get into those in a minute, but there is a benefit of the doubt point I do just want to briefly make. There are many who claim that the first reference, even though indirectly, of the Ebionites is actually Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho in 140. Basically, Trypho, or the alleged Trypho, it's debatable whether or not Trypho actually existed, but I'm going to assume he existed for the sake of argument. Trypho asks if somebody who wants to follow the customs of the Old Testament will be saved if he accepts Jesus as the Messiah, to which Justin Martyr replies yes, but if he starts trying to force other people to have to follow the different aspects of the Torah, then that will not work, right? And it is believed by some that when Justin Martyr says this, that he is actually making this distinction because there is this distinction in different sects of Christian thought. I don't buy that. I just don't think that's accurate. That in no way, shape, or form sounds to me like anything that is referencing the Ebionites. And in fact, I think the fact that he does not specifically mention any group like the Ebionites, actually does more to show that the Ebionites started sometime in the late or mid first century, rather than in the or later mid second century, rather than in the first century after the crucifixion of Jesus, because we don't have in this dialogue with Trypho, who is a Jew, right, who is giving Jewish objections to the messiahship of Jesus, we don't have any reference on the part of Justin Martyr or Trypho. And you would think the Ebionites would be a very important topic to them, considering the fact that they would be a group of Christians who allegedly has a line of tradition all the way back to James, right? And had most of the other apostles on their side and was following the traditions of the Jews. You would think that that would be brought up at some point, but neither Justin Martyr nor Trypho mentions it. So if anything, this is not actually a reference to the Ebionites, but proof positive that they did not exist by 140, or at the very least were not relevant by 140. I would go as far as to say they definitely did not exist by 140, and that it's sometime between 140 and 189 that somebody establishes this group, right? But let's just give them the benefit of the doubt and say that this is a very indirect offshoot reference to the Ebionites. That's 107 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. Okay, 107 years. It's believed that Paul was executed around the year 64. So, what is that? That is 76 years after the execution of Paul. It is believed that James was executed roughly around the same time, about 65, so about 75 years after the execution of James. Right? This is even 45 years to 40 years after the 45 to 40, because we don't know exactly when this happened, right? After the death of John, the very last of the disciples, right? What's up with that? Why is it so late in the historical record that we have this one really, really indirect, which of course proves, if this is talking about the Ebionites, which again I don't think it is, but if this is talking about the Ebionites, the fact that it's so nonchalant and indirect indicates most assuredly that this group is not important, that this group is not big, that this group is something that is just off on the side, preaching their very strange doctrine akin to the Jehovah's Witnesses in the modern day, right? Why is that? You would expect we would have something from them, something from the early disciples, something from the other people who were talking about the Ebionites, talking about this group of people before 189, after the faith is already 150 years old, right? But you don't see that. And there's a reason, of course, you don't see that. It's because the Ebionites didn't exist back then. And, by the way, this actually lets us segue into his fourth point, this Catholic Church being founded by Paul nonsense. Rabbi Avraham has to answer the question as to why people outside of Pauline tradition were affirming the same thing that Paul said. Okay, Mark is a perfect example. Mark is a pupil of Peter. Okay, Mark affirms the exact same things Paul says. Now you say that Mark is the same as John Mark, and I would affirm that, and you would say that John Mark is a companion of Paul. Yes, but he is, according to every single reference we have, a pupil of Peter. So by the time he's even with Paul, he's already an established speaker of the gospel at this point, assuming John Mark and Mark are the same person, right? But what about Polycarp and Ignatius and Papias? Those are all pupils of John. Why is it that they seem to affirm Pauline tradition? I would expect that John would actually be on the side of James, considering that John is an original apostle, right? But apparently, he's more on the side of Paul. Why is that? That seems very strange to me. Clement of Rome, right, is believed to be a pupil of Peter. Why does he affirm what it is that we affirm today as the Christian faith? Why doesn't he affirm something Ebionite? Right? This is, again, somebody outside of the Pauline tradition who gets their tradition from somebody who directly knew Jesus, and yet he falls in line perfectly with the Pauline tradition. Why is that? That seems very strange to me if the Pauline tradition is in fact a fabrication. That seems incredibly strange to me. But this claim that that the Catholic Church was founded by Paul is so patently absurd. And hang on, actually, I'm gonna push that down the line here a little bit, because I do want to read a little bit here on Britannica.com about the Ebionites, just to prove how ridiculous it is that this man here is claiming I just totally lost my train of thought. This man's claiming that these were the original guys. So, Ebionite. Member of an early ascetic sect of Jewish Christians, the Ebionites were one of several such sects that originated in and around Palestine in the 1st century AD and include the Nazarenes and Elkasites. The name of the sect is from the Hebrew Ebionim, or Ebionim, which means the poor. It was not founded, as later Christian writers stated, by a certain Ebion, at least according to Britannica here, but that is probably the most likely scenario, just so you guys are aware. At any rate, little information exists on the Ebionites, and the surviving accounts are subject to considerable debate since they are uniformly derived from the Ebionites' opponents. The first mention of the sect is in the works of Christian theologian Irenaeus, notably in his Adversus Heresias, which is against heresies, roughly the year 180 to 189. Other sources include the writings of Origen. Origen was born 184, would die in around 240, and Saint Epiphanes of Constantia, also a 3rd century writer. It says the Ebionite movement may have arisen from the time of the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Now, I want you guys to kind of... this is actually something that is really funny, because here you have a reference. First off, it is very clearly hypothetical, theoretical. Right, the Ebionite movement may have arisen from the time of the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, right? But if you're going to make a claim like that, this would be the perfect time to insert, there is some sort of a tradition that says that James founded this group. You don't find that. Rather, you find that at best, theoretical best, because it's 109 years before the earliest reference of them, theoretical best, they might have come out of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70. Possibly, right? But no, nothing about James here at all. It just says its members evidently left Palestine to avoid persecution and settled in Transjordan, notably at Pelah and Syria, and were later known to be in Asia Minor and Egypt. This sect seems to have existed into the 4th century and then died out. So, seems to me like there was a perfect point there that they could have slid in a reference to James or a reference to some sort of a feud with Paul, but you don't actually find that. And actually, interestingly enough, excuse me, Rabbi Ben Avraham would go on later on in his dialogue with me to say that, and also in his video, to say that they did not, and by they I mean the Ebionites, did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah, but here, just as a perfect reference here, on Britannica, it says they believed in one God and taught that Jesus was the Messiah and the true prophet mentioned in Deuteronomy 18:15. So that's just patently false. At any rate, there you have it, right? There is no reference to them to 189. The best theories say they may have originated in 70, which is still too late because James would have died at that point. According to Josephus Flavius, James died before the war actually started, the war being the Jewish-Roman War between 66 and 73 that resulted in the destruction of the Jewish city of Jerusalem in 70, of course. Why is that? Why is the lack of reference here to James having a feud? Well, because that's not what happened. But at any rate, the next claim here, this idea that the Catholic Church was somehow invented by Paul, is just absurd. It's hilarious. First off, that's not even what the Catholics teach. Okay, the Catholics actually teach that it was Peter who founded the Catholic Church, not Paul. So that's just not only do you not know what actually happened in history, but you don't even know the claim of the Catholics themselves, right? Irenaeus seems to indicate that, like every apostle would, Peter and Paul rather did actually go and preach together in Rome, and that they founded a church there in Rome. Now we have Clement of Alexandria, Polycarp, Ignatius, and Paul, who all write to Rome, and all of them seem to indicate a what you call a what is the word there? Presbyterian episcopate, rather, right? Which means that there was a collection of elders that led the church, not a pope, right? The first reference to any pope is in 292 AD. Any pope in Rome, okay? The first reference to anything that could be remotely considered the Roman Catholic Church is not until 609, okay? It's not even legal to have Christianity in Rome until like 306 or something like that, and it becomes state religion in 380. They don't have their own book until 405. The idea that Paul was somehow alive, writing the Vulgate in 405, preaching to legal Christianity in 306, right? That it's just absurd. It's hilarious. There is no reference to any Catholic doctrine whatsoever existing before the year 155 at best. And I say at best because in the year 155 you have a bishop of Rome who is mentioned, and of course this is after Polycarp and Ignatius have already written their works. So sometime between the year 110 and 155, we have an establishment of a monarchical episcopate rather than a presbyterial episcopate in Rome, right? That does not necessarily even mean that that's a Catholic doctrine, right? Because there are plenty of other places that have a monarchical episcopate. Sorry, it's a hard term to say. Which just means, by the way, that there's a single bishop leading the church. But if you wanted to make a claim that that is a strictly Catholic doctrine, then the earliest we have of any Catholic doctrine is 155 AD. The earliest we have of any actual Catholic doctrine, or anything that could be considered a Catholic doctrine, doesn't come until the 3rd or 4th century. So, I mean, and I have challenged Rabbi Ben Avraham numerous times. Show me some sort of a reference that exists that says that Paul founded the Catholic Church. I will wait all day. You can find me, like I said, you can find me references in Eusebius or Irenaeus that say that him and Peter founded the church in Rome, okay? But the church in Rome and the Catholic Church are not the same thing, and you have to demonstrate to me that they are. You say, well, it's the Roman Catholic Church. Duh, C.J., right? That's a perfectly fair argument if you're completely historically illiterate and have no idea what the actual historical records say, because the Catholic Church has a specific way of doing things. They have particular doctrines. They have a particular tradition, and none of that exists in the Church of Rome at a bare minimum till 155. And if you want to actually argue real Catholic doctrine, not until 609. They don't even have a book until 405. They don't even have legalization until sometime in the early 300s, and they're not the state religion of Rome until 380. So it's just patently absurd, ridiculous, nonsensical garbage that the Catholic Church existed back in the early 1st century or any time before its legalization, Christianity's legalization, and subsequent turning into the state religion of Rome. That's just, I mean, and the idea that Paul was somehow able to just completely wipe away, this 5th point, right, any and all references to the, excuse me, just one moment, any and all references whatsoever to the, quote, true followers of Jesus is, again, not backed up anywhere in the historical record. It doesn't exist. Okay, there's no backing up of this historical record whatsoever. It is simply your own claim in order to try and make Jesus better fit your own opinions. And again, Rabbi Ben Avraham, I challenge you, find me a reference, any reference, historical reference, to Paul founding the Catholic Church, to James founding the Ebionites, to a big schism between Paul and James, to Paul covering up all of the different works of the quote-unquote original disciples of Jesus, to Paul, or to fabrication at all of any of the books of the Bible, because that is something I would like to challenge you on very profusely. This whole idea, it's the idea that Acts was written sometime between 100 and 120. I mean, it's hilarious. It's just historical garbage. And I'm sorry, but that's the only way that this can actually be described. Now, I want to actually start reading the comments on this video, and the reason I want to do this is because this will just kind of show you guys how little of an argument this man actually has. Okay? Now, this is my initial comment, and I'm going to read you guys word for word what happens here. Okay? So I said, still propagating this nonsense. No matter, there is plenty of evidence that these theories are untrue, and no good evidence that they are true. Point number 1. Luke is the author of Acts, and Luke between 54 and 62 AD, and Luke, and Luke between 54 and 62 AD, that was actually not very well typed out on my part, apparently, but what I mean by that is that that's when he wrote Luke and Acts, which was between 54 and 62 AD. No good evidence at all exists to say otherwise. I was presented none later on. You'll see that. Point number 2, because he claimed that there was no persecution of early Christians and that Paul could not have possibly been persecuting Christians because the Pharisees didn't persecute Christians. But it is, I said, point number 2, it's a very well-known fact that the Jews persecuted early Christians. So I don't know where you get this idea that the Pharisees didn't persecute Christians. That's all I said. But the things that I was talking about it being a very well-known fact are, you have, just as one example, because of course we have the New Testament, right? But that can't be trusted because God forbid anybody's able to trust the New Testament, right? Nonetheless, though, you have Josephus Flavius talks about the high priest's killing of James, right? They say that they stoned him to death and then clubbed him. That's what Josephus says the high priest did. So even there, you just have one perfect example of known Pharisaic persecution of the Christians. And excuse me real quick while I plug in my laptop here. Hopefully it won't die on me. Nonetheless, if it does, I'll just pull up my cell phone and we'll do it that way. But point number 3, why does no historian from the period at all reference this feud? None of the 27 books of the New Testament, none of the known Christian writers from 70 AD to 180 AD. Again, I could have actually stretched that all the way to the 1500s, but I did not. Like Barnabas, Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp, Pius, Sibelius, Protaxus, Origen, Clement of Alexandria, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, etc., or even the cult leaders like Marcion or Valentinius, or even the non-Christian writers like Tacitus, Josephus Flavius, or Pliny the Elder. The best you have is small subsects broke off and formed offshoot cults, but no major schism of James versus Paul is ever mentioned in writings within 300 years of the matter. And again, I could have gone as far as saying 1500 years of the matter, but I didn't for some reason. I guess I just wasn't really properly thinking at the time. But I digress. Think about that. I was winning and I wasn't even properly thinking. Point number 4, you have already been thoroughly debunked on your baffling historical garbage on the Ebionites in a video I did, which you promised to debate me on, by the way. Never did. But anyways, the Ebionites did believe Jesus was the Messiah, but did not believe he was Son of God. Further, they did not exist until the late 2nd century, being mentioned nowhere in the historical record. Excuse me, sorry, this stupid pop-up is coming up. Nowhere in the historical record until Irenaeus in Adversus Heresias 189 AD, 156 years after Jesus was crucified. Even further, they are not the same as the Nazarenes. He claims they were the same as the Nazarenes, as Nazarenes believed in the virgin birth, and that Jesus was the Son of God, and lived in a totally different area of the world. And you got the Ebionites' location wrong as well. They lived in Upper Arabia and Jordan, as of course we just saw in that Britannica article, not Jerusalem, because he claimed Jerusalem. He also claimed Galatia and Corinth. Number 5, because he made the claim that Philo referenced this feud and that James was the leader. That's patently absurd. Philo never speaks about James or any early Christians at all. It's actually one of the big arguments atheists like to use against Christianity, is that Philo never mentions anything the Christians say at all, or anything about John the Baptist. He has no reference of them whatsoever, and I challenge Rabbi Ben Avraham to show me. Likewise, Josephus never mentions a feud, which is another thing that he claims in this video, and he, again, will not present any counter-argument to any of these points. 6th, there was no Catholic Church writers in the 1st and 4th century, and Paul had literally nothing to do with the Catholic Church at all. Have you studied anything at all on the issue? I don't think you have. That ends my initial comment. We go down here and we see a response from Rabbi Ben Avraham, and he says, again, we're going to quote the whole thing. No, your nonsense is what is not supported and absolutely illogical. These are absolute facts by renowned scholars and historians. The only ones who fight are the idolaters like you, who do not want to stop your pagan worship of a man, even when the original movement would call you out as they did Paul. No one reported the feud. Yes, the church father Origen did. He mentioned that the Ebionites hated Paul and called him out. This is facts. So you hear that. No one reported the feud. Yes, the church father Origen did. So he's claiming that Origen, he is telling me, he has historical references that say Origen mentioned a feud between James and Paul. And I challenge him on that. Say, Origen mentioned a feud, really, between Paul and James. Care to show any evidence of that? Let's see what his response is. I said the Ebionites which followed that James led their movement for 30 years after his death. Wow, pal, this is not very hard to find information. How can you not know that James led them for 30 years? So notice, 3 things. Number 1, change the subject. Number 2, right, the subject was Origen mentioning a feud between James and Paul. He's saying no, Origen mentioned that the Ebionites didn't like Paul, right? Which is not at all what I claimed when I said no historians from the time mentioned. I didn't say no historians from the time mentioned Ebionites. I pointed out that Irenaeus did, right? I said that no historians from the time mentioned a feud. He claimed Origen did as a refutation of my point, then did not provide a reference to Origen, which is point number 2 you need to reference. And then point number 3, he said that not only did James lead the Ebionites for 30 years after Jesus' death, but that it is not very hard to find this information. How can you not know that James led them for 30 years? So how can I not know that James led the Ebionites for 30 years? It's obvious, right? Everyone knew this. So let's challenge him on that. I said no historians mentioned the alleged James-Paul feud, not the Ebionites. Try again. Third time's a charm. Oh, and no, they didn't. By no, they didn't, I mean no, they were not led by James, these Ebionites, right? The evidence you claim does not exist. What evidence do you have to support the thesis that the Ebionites followed James? Don't worry, I'll wait. Okay, so let's see. Does he present us some evidence that the Ebionites followed James? This is his next one. Okay. He says, no, you need to try again. As far as beliefs of the Ebionites, the documents of the New Testament critically evaluated are our best sources, including some of the fragmentary traditions which are embedded in the book of Acts 7:37 through 53. By the way, none of this comment is his writing, but rather it is copy and pasted from Ebionite.com. So just point that out. At any rate, these are fragments and quotations surviving from their Hebrew gospel tradition, according to A.F.J. Cligin, Jewish Christian gospel tradition, and also E.J. Brill from 1992. The so-called pseudo-Clementine material, as well as some traditions reflected in the text, such as the Hebrew Matthew preserved by Ibn Shaprut and now published in a critical edition by George Howard, the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, Mercer University Press, 1995. Based on what we can reliably put together from the sources, we can say the Ebionite or Nazarene movement could be distinguished by the following views. Okay. Quick question. Did that paragraph, and this is not the end of the comment, right? But did that paragraph address at all whatsoever any sort of reference in history to James being the leader of the Ebionites for 30 years or to Origen mentioning the James-Paul feud? No, it did not, but we continue. Point 1. Jesus as a human being with father and mother, but designated a prophet like Moses or the anointed of the Spirit, who will be revealed in power as the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven following his rejection and death, and gives references such as Acts 7:37, Luke 4:18-19, Mark 10:35-45, and 13:26 through 27. None of which claim that he had a father and mother, or that he was not divine, by the way. That would just be patently absurd. And you can go, of course, check any of those if you don't believe me. Disdain for eating meat and even the temple slaughter of animals, preferring the ideals of a pre-flood diet, and what they took to be the original ideal of worship, which is shown in Genesis 9:1-5, Jeremiah 7:21-22, Isaiah 11:9, 66, 1-4. This reflects a general interest in seeking the path reflected in the pre-Sinai revelation, especially the time from Enoch to Noah. For example, divorce was shunned as violating the Edenic ideal, even though technically it was later allowed by Moses. Mark 10:2-11. 3. Dedication to following the whole Torah as applicable to Israel and the Gentiles, but through the easy yoke or the Torah of liberty of their teacher Jesus, which emphasized the spirit of the biblical prophets and restoration of true faith, the ancient paths. Jeremiah 6:16, Matthew 11:28-30, James 2:8-13, Matthew 5:17-18, 9:13, 12:7, from which, by and large, they believed the establishment Jewish groups of Second Temple times had departed. 4. Rejection of the, quote, doctrines and traditions, end quote, of men, which they believed had been added to the pure Torah of Moses, including scribal alterations of the text of Scripture, Jeremiah 8:8. Generally, the movement came to have a very negative view of Paul as an apostate from the Torah, though it is possible that the 2nd and 3rd centuries that were branches of the Nazarenes who are more tolerant of Paul as the apostles of the Gentiles, but who as Jews nonetheless insisted on Torah observance. Now, this paragraph here is his best possible reference, because everything else we've read so far is explaining to us what the Ebionites believe and has literally nothing to do with the historical claim of a James-Paul feud, and literally nothing to do with a historical claim of James leading the Ebionites for 30 years. James hasn't even been mentioned yet, right? So clearly he did not understand the point, but he says generally the movement came to have a very negative view of Paul as an apostate of the Torah, which is the closest you can get to anything remotely close to what I've asked for. But let's point out something very clear. just because this group did not like Paul does not in any way, shape, or form mean that James led the Ebionites for 30 years. That is a ridiculous conclusion. And just because this group did not like Paul does not mean in any way, shape, or form that James and Paul had a big schism, nor does it mean that James or whatever other side was on this schism that didn't actually happen was in the right. None of that is indicated by this at all. No reference to James. James's name hasn't even been mentioned. We finish here with the last paragraph, which this is, of course, from Ebionite.org, which says, and this is when we start finally being able to get to James, right? And so here we go. Notate this. Get your notebooks out. You're going to find our historical reference to James, right? For much of the whole underbelly of the original Jesus movement, led by James, the brother of Jesus, its relationship with the Dead Sea Scroll sects and the Ebionites and their subsequent history, see Robert Eisman, James, the brother of Jesus, Penguin, 1998. So, did you read that? Let's continue on, see, because I want to just make sure that that's the only reference we're going to be given that James led this Ebionite movement. Let's just see, right? There was a new unabridged edition of the work as well here, Ebionite.org, but I recommend the original for serious students of early Christianity. On Jewish Christianity more generally, C.J. Shope's Jewish Christianity from Philadelphia Fortress Press, 1969, out of print but still useful for students as a general introduction. For a modern interpretation of the Ebionite ideals reflecting the peaceful ideals of vegetarianism and nonviolence, see Keith Akers' The Lost Religion of Jesus, Simple Living and Nonviolence in Early Christianity, Latern Book 2000. Finally, there is an active Ebionite movement today that seeks to revive and reflect these ancient perspectives. See the website ebionite.org that we are, of course, here on. Okay. So our earliest reference to James, leading the Ebionites for 30 years, you heard it yourself, is not anything the Ebionites said, but a book from 1998 called James, the Brother of Jesus, which has a little bit of its backing from a book from 1969. A whole whopping 1,936 years after the crucifixion. But perfect. That'll suffice for an answer to my question, right? No, sorry. It definitely did not. So let's read what I said back here. Here you are, spending several minutes of your time explaining what it is that the Ebionites believe, as if it was even remotely the question. No historical evidence at all is found here in your little tirade that James led the Ebionite movement or that Paul and James had a massive feud. Again, the earliest reference he gives is 1998. It is a theory by a guy who thinks that he's smart because he has a PhD. There is no historical backing of this whatsoever. And just in case you think I'm wrong, I just challenged him on it, so he should show me, right? He should be able to show me. He says, no, once again, you don't comprehend that the only group who was Jewish and Torah observant that was relevant was the Ebionites, and their beliefs and attacks against Paul match what Paul attacked them for. Nothing else matches. This is well known. If you choose to ignore these facts of history, that's your problem. The point is, Paul was not close with the disciples, and his own letters prove this very clearly. So all your rhetoric and attacks does not line up with anything that we have on the table. Again, no reference to Origen or anyone else talking about this feud between James and Paul. No actual reference to James being the leader of the Ebionites. Rather, he just says, we know that because of Paul's writings, Paul was not close with the disciples, which, by the way, is patently absurd. And if you watch this video that he did, you can actually prove that he doesn't believe this because he thinks that the texts of the epistles, right, actually paint Paul as close with the apostles, even though he wasn't. So you can't say that his writings indicate he wasn't close with the apostles, and also that he's lying about his writings indicating he's close with the apostles at the same time. That just doesn't make any sense. But nonetheless, I digress. The only group that was Torah observant that was relevant was the Ebionites. No, not true. All the early Christians were Torah observant. They were not Torah-centric. Okay? There is a huge difference. And we already know the Nazarenes followed it in its integrity, the Torah. They circumcised their kids, all of that other kind of stuff. But they believed all the core doctrines of Christianity. They were not the Ebionites. That's a very well-established fact. And I respond here. That's just untrue. I have given you multiple chances now, so I know for a fact you have no evidence whatsoever that James and Paul had a big feud or that James led the Ebionites, even though you lied and claimed to have both. By the way, the Ebionites were not the only Torah-observant Christians. This is another lie on your part, devoid whatsoever of any evidence. I'm still waiting on that so-called evidence you don't actually have. Again, referencing his alleged quote that we know for a fact James led the Ebionites for 30 years, and we know for a fact that Origen talked about this big feud. What does he say? Many scholars agree with this. Not the question. As well as the entire family's tomb was found, covered up by the elitists you cover for, to hide that. So apparently I cover for elitist people, right? That's hilarious. To hide the reality that none of his followers believe the nonsense adopted by Christians off of a Catholic tradition. So here you go into his quotation of, or his alleged conspiracy theories, right, of Paul founding the Catholic Church. So too, Messianics also adopt a lot from Catholic idolatrous pagan Jesus, contrary to what real Yeshua followers believed, who did not like Paul. If they did, there would be a Paul-based movement that was Jewish and preserved in history. Hello, it became purely Gentile, and the Ebionites were gone, erased from history. So too James until recently, and for good reason. That's what I am revealing in this video. There are undeniable facts. You have zero proof that Paul and the disciples were a team like Acts tries to portray. It just does not match anything in the historical record. Disciples keep Torah. Paul was anti-Torah, and the church records, as well as scholars identify, Paul was opposed by the Jews living who believed in Yeshua. Nothing Jewish preserved in Paul. If so, name it. I'll wait. This is hilarious, and that just died, so I'm going to pull up this quotation here and the rest of it actually on my phone right now. This is absurd. This is absolutely hilarious, right? You have this man claiming that, first off, no Torah, excuse me, no Torah-based movement no Torah-centric movement, right, who followed the teachings of Paul. Again, I've already pointed out numerous times that is not true. The Nazarenes exist, and they are not the Ebionites. That is a very well-established fact, okay? And they did accept Paul as an apostle and as a prophet to the Gentiles, okay? Something that his own reference actually pointed out, these groups that existed in the 2nd and 3rd century, okay? He says that there is nothing Jewish in what Paul wrote. Really, so Paul didn't recite the Shahada, or not the Shahada, sorry, that's the Islamic version of it. Hear, O God, the Lord our God is one God. He didn't turn people away from idolatrous practice. He didn't tell people to have a moralistic lifestyle based directly out of the Levitical law. Because I can show you plenty of references where he did, and I don't have very much time. I only got about 5 minutes before I hit the hour point, so I have to make this quick. But if you want to challenge me on that, again, I invite you to have a dialogue here. Let's go ahead and discuss it. Just as a perfect example, all of 1 Corinthians 7 deals with things that Jesus talked about and that the Torah talks about in regards to marriage and the proper way for a Christian to act. But nonetheless, this idea, right, that there's nothing Jewish at all in what Paul taught, just patently absurd. Just patently absurd. Furthermore, okay, and actually, let me just go ahead and pull this video. But furthermore, this idea that there was this big cover-up, he says there's no evidence whatsoever that the reconciliation happened. That's just not true. All evidence that exists says the reconciliation happened. Acts itself, all the 27 books, or the 26 books of the New Testament that are not Acts, Ignatius, Polycarp, Tertullian, etc., all the way down the road. Every single Christian writer in existence, including the pagan ones, up until at a bare minimum, the time of the Ebionites in 189 AD, says that Paul and James reconciled, or omits absolutely no reference whatsoever to any sort of schism. So that is just patently absurd. It's not true. Okay. Sorry, I keep wanting to type in this video, and I am actually limited here on time. So let me pull this up very quickly. And thank you guys actually for your patience here. Won't actually be taking me too long because it's a very recent video. And being is that I am the commenter, it of course goes straight to my comments being at the top. So, where fireworks going off? View replies. Here we go, back to what it was that was said here. The entire family's tomb was found. Which family? I guess I'm not entirely sure because he doesn't specifically reference. I assume James's family is what he's saying. I've never heard anything like that. However, the idea that there's a cover-up by somebody of this is definitely not backed up by anything he puts here. There's no source whatsoever given to a book, whether from 1998 or from way back in the time when we're actually trying to find references, right? He says, also, that the Messianics have adopted a lot of Catholic idolatrous pagan practices. Again, the Catholic Church did not exist back then. If you're going to claim it did, prove it. Give me historical references. Not from 1998. Not from 1998. I want a historical reference that is either something that has been dug up or something that was written about back then, indicating what you are saying, that the Catholic Church was founded back then, that the original followers of Jesus followed anything other than what is taught in the New Testament. Show me a single reference. One is all I've been asking for in this entire tirade. Okay? It became purely Gentile, and the Ebionites were gone, erased from history. Not true. Not true. All 12 of the disciples of Jesus were, of course, Jews. Barnabas was a Jew. It is believed by many that Luke was a Jew. Mark was a Jew. Timothy was a Jew, right? I mean, this is just patently absurd. This idea that there was no Trypho, right? If Trypho was a real person, he was a Jew. He may not have been. The Nazarenes were Jews who did exist, who are not the Ebionites. It's just, I mean, I've stressed that point way too much, and I'm running low on time here, so I just need to continue. That's he says that's what he's revealing in this video. You have zero proof that Paul and the disciples were a team like Acts tries to portray. Actually, I have all proof. I have Acts. I have the other 26 books in the New Testament. I have the writings of Barnabas, and the writings of Ignatius, and the writings of Origen, and the writing of Tertullian, and Polycarp, and Papias, and Eusebius, and Ambrose, and etc. We can go way down the line. No references in the first 1,000 years of Christianity, whether it be a Christian, a cultic Christian, a pagan, a Jew, a Muslim, nobody referencing any sort of feud between Paul and the disciples that was anything greater than the incidents in Antioch, right? Nonetheless, continue. You've got to be kidding me. Or this is me talking, right? Are you just not going to acknowledge the fact that this evidence does not exist? It's not real, Rabbi. No documentation at all exists that states Paul led a purely Gentile movement and James led a purely Jewish one. No evidence exists that states Paul and James had a schism or that Paul founded the Catholic Church or that James led the Ebionites, and your utter inability to provide any documentation stating otherwise is undeniable proof of this. He responds, "It does exist, clown. It does. I presented a clear and obvious case, which anybody with logic and critical thinking can put together and match the evidence from the horse's mouth. Your phony arguments are illogical, and once again, where is the Pauline-based Torah movement evidence? I'll wait. Where is it in history? Because his movement very clearly made Roman Catholic Church, as this was his major audience. Greeks and Romans. Hello? Anybody home? Please think, try again. The only movement that lasted was Jewish and believed in the real historical Yeshua was the Ebionites. So you have no case. I do." I mean, that's direct quotation. You've heard it for yourself. We continue. You claim, this is me again. You claim you've presented a clear argument, yet you've presented none of the evidence asked of you. You've claimed that Paul must have founded the Catholic Church because a Torah movement with Paul's name doesn't exist, but that's hilarious and historical garbage. Jesus' followers weren't preaching observing Torah. None of the apostles have a Torah-based movement. We're strictly preaching Torah is actually what I meant there. Preaching strictly observing Torah, right? None of the apostles have a Torah-based movement in their name because none of them preached it. None. Not Paul, not James, not Peter or John or Timothy, none of them. Because that's not what Jesus taught. And you still have not provided any evidence to the contrary at all. Just claimed that you're so, quote, he's quoting me is what I mean in this claim, right? Just claimed you're so incredibly illogical when you're unable to even provide basic historical documentation when asked. Then I'd point out, and Timothy, Luke, Barnabas, John Mark, and etc. were all Jewish and companions of Paul. Acts 21:15-21 shows Paul as a Torah observant. Romans 3:31, written by Paul, says, "Do we then nullify the law through faith? May it never be. On the contrary, we establish the law." Romans 2:13 says, "For not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God, but the doers of the law will be justified." So to claim that Paul didn't observe Torah is actually patently absurd. To which he responds, "Yawn." And then we end the conversation. So, I mean, there you have it. From his own mouth, the horse's mouth himself, right? It's a little term that he likes to use. From the horse's mouth, right there, you see. He claimed Origen mentioned this feud. I pressed him on it. No reference to Origen mentioning this feud. He claimed that it was everybody knew, all historians knew, that James led the Ebionite movement. I asked him to give me any historical reference. The one that he gives me is earliest in 1998. The year was born, okay? I asked him for any sort of reference that there was a schism between Paul and James at all. Forget the Origen one. At all from the time. He gives none. And then he propagates nonsensical theories like there was a big cover-up by Paul and the Romans to found the Roman Catholic Church and get rid of the Ebionite movement, and that the Ebionites were the only Torah-based movement, which again is patently absurd because, first and foremost, it's wrong. There are the Nazarenes and other groups like that, but secondly, that is not what Jesus preached. None of the apostles have a Torah-based movement in their lineage because it's not based on Torah. It's based on Jesus. The Torah is in it, yes, just like Moses is in it, just like Hosea is in it. Find me one single Hosea-based Jewish group. Oh, you can't, right? Exactly, because it's part of your religion. It is not the centrality of your religion, and that is the point that I hope that the listeners of this video have gotten. There is no Torah-centric Christianity founded in the lineage of the disciples, including the Ebionites, and you have seen very clearly he was unable to provide even the documentation he claimed existed, like Origen referencing a Paul versus James feud, and like tons of historical evidence, all of the historical evidence he claimed, right, talking about a 30-year leadership of the Ebionites under James, and also documentation that he claimed he had on a Catholic cover-up of the James movement. None of that was, of course, found. You can go to the video yourself. I'll put a link in the description to show that he did not at all claim that, and that I didn't leave anything out. I just gave you everything that happened in the dialogue between me and him, and he is completely unable to present the evidence, and the reason is the evidence does not exist. It's false, and he can come on anytime and have a dialogue with me if he would like to defend that, because I'm perfectly willing, and I'll give him his due time. We can have equal time. We can make it formal, 20 minutes and 20 minutes, right? You saw my debate with Marcus Harris, Rabbi Ben Avraham. If you don't believe that I am capable of having some sort of a fair debate, go to my debate with Marcus Harris on the subject of the Israelites being black. Watch it. You'll see very, very, very obviously that I am perfectly willing to have a formal and organized and respectful debate with you on this topic if you think that you can defend it, or even provide a video response for the record. I'll be waiting. That'll be everything we have for tonight, my friends. I am just about out of time. I'm actually a little bit over time by about 5-ish minutes, 6-ish minutes. So we're going to end off with a prayer and then get out of here. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for the ability to read your word and to look at the historical records, Lord, and be able to deduce what it is that actually happened in the past. We know that there are many who have tried to do this in the past, Lord, and just have not had the tools to do so. So we thank you for being able to have the tools to do so, Lord. I pray that you change the hearts of those who have been listening to these falsehoods about your word and about your disciples, Lord. And I pray that you use this video for nothing more than the glorification of your name and your kingdom. In Jesus Christ's holy name I pray, and we give God all the glory. Amen. And we do certainly mean that. Blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And of course, give all glory to the Most High God, because he is the only thing in existence, including existence itself, that deserves it. Shalom, you guys have a great evening.